whiteboard. Okay, alrighty, great. So we're moving on now to look at criterion validity. At comorbidity. So comorbidity is related to the idea of symptom overlap, but it is slightly different. Comorbidity refers to the diagnosis of two diseases simultaneously. And so it's very rare for somebody to just get a diagnosis of schizophrenia. They usually get a diagnosis of schizophrenia and something else. Schizophrenia and depression, schizophrenia and anxiety disorder, schizophrenia and substance abuse. So schizophrenia on its own is very, very rare. Why is this an issue if these, two illnesses like depression and schizophrenia are going hand in hand so frequently?
It could lead to like wrong prescriptions of drugs and stuff that could actually make the condition worse.
Absolutely, yep. And I think if we don't know whether somebody's got schizophrenia or depression because they look so similar, maybe we need to question the validity of schizophrenia. Maybe schizophrenia is not so different to depression. Maybe they are just sort of subsets of the same disorder. If they go hand in hand so frequently, are they truly distinct? So we need to really ask ourselves these questions. If those conditions occur together very frequently, then the validity comes into question. Are we just simply bad at diagnosing each condition? Could it be that they are the same condition? And when we think about that symptom overlap, yeah, the evidence is building up that perhaps schizophrenia and depression are not distinct illnesses. So let's have a look at some of the evidence for comorbidity. So schizophrenic patients are often diagnosed with another disorder at the same time. So they might receive, for instance, a diagnosis of depression first and then schizophrenia later, but in any case, they hold two diagnoses simultaneously. So they're diagnosed frequently with depression. So 50% of schizophrenics will also have a diagnosis of depression. Substance abuse, 47% of schizophrenics also have a comorbidity of substance abuse. Can anyone suggest why that might be?
It could be a coping mechanism for them instead of taking a very harsh medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-medicating, basically. And so it might not be a conscious choice that they've chosen not to take the antipsychotics. It could just be before diagnosed, they then self-medicate with other substances like alcohol, for example, as a way to cope. Hello, we've just had Amy join. Hello. Amy, I'm recording this, so at the end, if you just want to go back and watch the beginning again, and then you can do. We're talking about comorbidity.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. We also see comorbidities with post-traumatic stress disorder. So 29% of schizophrenics also have a diagnosis of PTSD, and 23% of schizophrenics have a diagnosis of OCD. This is interesting, isn't it? This is really interesting. So much of the research into schizophrenia is with patients that do not have comorbidities because they kind of confound the sample a little bit. But the people with schizophrenia who only have schizophrenia are so rare and are not representative of normal schizophrenics who generally have a comorbidity. And so a lot of the research is really flawed because we're not comorbidity. So we're going to do a little bit of maths now. Let's see how we go. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do this. I've got two questions for you. Question number one. Now, guys, if I write on here, can you see that up there? You absolutely cannot. Right, let me move you in front of the whiteboard. That's better. Okay. Question one. I'm going to rephrase that. Although hang on. This says, what is the ratio of substance abuse to OCD? And I would like an estimate, please. So whole numbers, just the closest estimate of the ratio of substance abuse to OCD. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have a go at working that out. And then you've got a second question. I don't know if you can see that at all. Let's come a bit closer. All right, who's answered that first one? An estimate of the ratio of substance abuse to OCD.
Is it 2 to 1?
Yeah, how did you arrive at that?
I just doubled OCD, which is 46.
Yeah.
So
Substance abuse is 47% to OCD, which is
23.
23. Yeah. So if we divide by 23, we arrive at more or less an estimate of a ratio of 2 to 1. So for every schizophrenic that's got a comorbidity diagnosis of OCD, we would expect to see 2 schizophrenic patients to have a comorbidity diagnosis of substance abuse. If this fills you with dread, then it's something to go over again before your mock. So these are really common sorts of questions. Relatively simple maths, but you just need to know how to do it. Okay, so that's our first question, estimating the ratio. The second question, I'd like you to estimate how many patients in a sample of 167 schizophrenics have a comorbidity of OCD. So you need to do a bit of work with percentages and multiplication here. Has anyone had a chance to estimate there? And can you tell me you're working?
I've got 38.4.
Fantastic. Max, talk me through your thought process. How did you get there?
I did 167 times 23%, or 23 over 100.
Fantastic. Yeah, we need to include that step as well. All these questions we need to, it will say show you're working. So we need to do that first of all. So 23 over 100 is 0.23.
Yeah.
And then 167, which is our sample size, times 0.23, and we should get an estimate of 38. So if it's an estimate, whole numbers is fine. There are probably other ways to do it that would be credit worthy as well, but I think that's the simplest way. The problem, Max, and this happens a lot with scientists and mathematicians, is that you leave off this step here because it's such a given, it's such an automatic thing to do that you don't write it down. And especially if you're using a calculator, then you just get to that immediately. But you need to make sure that you're getting your mark here and here and here. So just make sure that you're including every single step of your working. No shortcuts, please. Yeah. And it does happen with students that are more confident with maths, I think. The ones that don't need to write it down tend to be the ones that lose the marks. Okie doke. Well done. Thank you, Max. All right. Everybody else, I hope that was all right. Hope that didn't fill you with too much dread. But it's a good time to remember that 10% of your Psych A level is going to be math skills. So very similar to that kind of thing. Okay, so comorbidities exist. It's very rare for somebody with schizophrenia to solely get a diagnosis of schizophrenia. They often receive a simultaneous diagnosis of another mental disorder, like depression, like substance abuse, PTSD, or OCD. So we need to ask ourselves some questions here. This is the issues that arise. If patients are being diagnosed very frequently with both schizophrenia and depression, are we just bad at diagnosing those disorders? Do we really know what depression looks like? Do we really know what schizophrenia looks like? Probably not. Why do you think doctors are giving comorbid diagnoses? Why are they giving 2 at once? Charlotte, what do you think?
It's because they like, maybe the patient doesn't have the exact symptoms that are on the diagnosis. Don't meet all the diagnostic criteria, so they're not sure, so it's better for them to receive treatment for both.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's uncertainty with the clinician. There's so much uncertainty surrounding the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and it's very rare that patients are going to perfectly conform to the diagnostic criteria. They're basically hedging their bets. They're making sure that they're not missing a diagnosis, and so it's easier if they're showing symptoms of both to give a diagnosis of both. But we need to really question, are they different disorders? If we've got A, so much symptom overlap, and B, if we're giving comorbidities so often, 50% of the time, then we need to question whether they are different. If severe depression looks a lot like schizophrenia, perhaps we could argue that it is the same disorder. Or perhaps they are subtypes of an overarching, yet to be discovered or coined disorder. But in any case, this presents a very, very confusing picture for the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Guys, do you have any questions about comorbidities? No? Okay. It is related to symptom overlap, but I don't want you to get confused between symptom overlap and comorbidities. The issue of symptom overlap leads to comorbidities, but they're different, okay? All right, so let's move on to get into some of the fun stuff. Going to what you're covering in issues and debates at the moment. So we're going to start with gender bias. What do you already know about any gender bias in the diagnosis of schizophrenia?
Males get diagnosed earlier.
Fantastic. They get diagnosed at a younger age. And
Is it more common in males?
yeah, they just get diagnosed more frequently. Absolutely. So gender bias here with the diagnosis of schizophrenia concerns the tendency to diagnose more men than women at a ratio of 1.4 to 1. So basically, in real terms, for every woman that's diagnosed with schizophrenia, 1.4 men, or to make it more sort of realistic, every 100 women, there's 140 men. So that's quite significant. There are quite a few men being diagnosed with schizophrenia over women. There's some other gender biases that exist. So the onset for men is much earlier. So men are diagnosed sort of 18 to 25 years, whereas women often go without a diagnosis until 25 to 35. So we need to question why that's happening. And there's also another point to make here as well, is that there are different peaks for men and women. So there are 2 peaks for men. What this means is that there's 2 sort of most frequent or 2 modes, the age of diagnosis. And so the 2 peaks for men to get diagnosed are 21 and 39. Can you see that at the top? No, you can't. Sorry, guys. There we go. So 21 and 39 are the 2 peaks for men to get diagnosed, and women have 3 peaks. They peak at 22, 37, and 62. Another very interesting difference there between men and women. Does anyone want to suggest why that might be? I don't have the answer, but maybe you're thinking of possibilities. Okay. Do you think then that there is a genuine genetic or biological reason for the differences between men and women when diagnosing schizophrenia? Could this be biological? Even if you don't agree with that, can you tell me some ideas what biological psychologists might suggest?
Hormones.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think sex hormones might exacerbate or protect from schizophrenia? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, guys, just put your hand up if you think that could be a possibility. You can, that the hand button down the bottom there. Yeah, a few. Good. Okay. Oh, most of you. Good. Okay, fantastic. You can, click off the hand. That's fine. Okay, good. Okay, so it's a possibility. And there is some evidence to suggest that this is the case. That, for example, they've treated women with schizophrenia with a female sex hormone alongside antipsychotics. And they found that their response to the antipsychotics was better. And so perhaps female sex hormones provide a bit of a protective factor against schizophrenia, which could then lead to the higher rates in men. Maybe. Is that most likely, though? Probably not. I would suggest that a better reason would be a genuine bias against women when diagnosing schizophrenia. Guys, why do you think this could be? Tell me your thoughts. Why are women not getting diagnosed and men are?
Maybe if like a woman's going through menopause or something, they might think it's because of the hormones rather than an actual diagnosis of schizophrenia?
Oh yeah, others I think will probably agree with you there. Yeah, definitely. And this has been classic for women throughout history. The diagnosis of women has got a very, very controversial past. The whole like label hysteria was basically women just being crazy and hormonal. So yeah, definitely, women who are showing signs of schizophrenia may be misinterpreted as just being hysterical and being women, whether that's in menopause or earlier in life, maybe. Any other suggestions? Who's diagnosing schizophrenia? Who are these psychiatrists?
Usually white, male, middle class people, men.
Exactly. We need to keep that in mind. We've spoken a lot about weird countries. In terms of, a lot of the research is based on Western industrialized, for example. But a lot of the research into mental illness has been based on a male-only sample. It's sort of taking this idea that a normal, healthy human is actually a normal, healthy man. And this means that if the symptoms stray from what classically men present with, then maybe we're missing out on diagnosing women if it doesn't look like the classic sort of stereotype of schizophrenia. So we need to remember two things. A, it's mostly men who are diagnosing schizophrenia, and B, most of the research involves men. And this is because women's hormones fluctuate, so it's harder to study them. But in any case, they're not included in research, and so what we know about schizophrenia does not reflect women with schizophrenia. So there's some possibilities. So although there might be genuine biological differences between men and women, which make women protected and make men more susceptible to schizophrenia, it is much more likely that there is a genuine bias when diagnosing the disorder. So some other points here is that clinicians fail to consider that men tend to suffer from more negative symptoms. So this means that women are suffering fewer negative symptoms. The ICD, what was necessary for a diagnosis? This is where
Just negative symptoms, was it?
you didn't need the positive symptoms, yeah, but you needed 2 negative symptoms. But men suffer more negative symptoms than women. And so it could be because women aren't presenting with as many negative symptoms, they might not be meeting the diagnostic criteria to get a diagnosis. Women are better at masking the negative symptoms, like avolition, for example. I think quite often in society, if women are mothers and have families, they can't afford to be apathetic. They've got jobs to do. And so they're better at sort of overcoming that avolition and therefore not presenting with that to a clinician and therefore not getting a diagnosis. So that could be part of the reason here. We know that women have better recovery rates and better relapse rates. Can anyone think why that would be? Okay, so quite often when women leave hospital, if they've been hospitalized for schizophrenia, they go back into their families. They go back into a supportive environment. And this is because of women's closer social networks than men's. So this could be that, women have that support, and that support is essential for relapse. Men might not have that same level of social support, and therefore relapse is more likely. So that could explain why women perhaps don't receive a diagnosis, or perhaps it's not ongoing. Women typically function better than men in certain areas. So as I said before, maintaining social relationships, maintaining a job and that kind of thing, women are able to generally cope better. And so when they present to a clinician, they're not severe enough. Their symptoms aren't bad enough to warrant a diagnosis. And so they'll often get ignored and sent away. Whereas a man is less able to cope with those symptoms. He's going to tick the boxes for schizophrenia and receive a diagnosis. Whereas if women are better at masking the symptoms and are better at coping with the symptoms, then they're going to miss out on a diagnosis. And that final point, there's higher interpersonal functioning. So better sort of social cognition, I guess, better ability to interact with other people in women than men. And so, sorry, Ben.
Hi, miss.
Hello. Oh, sorry. I thought
I've just got home.
That's fine, not a problem.
Yeah.
I'm recording this, and so you can go back and watch the beginning again when we're done.
All right, great. Thank you.
No worries. So that final point, there's personal functioning, better ability to cope with the symptoms, fewer negative symptoms experienced by women. That all means that women are missing out perhaps on diagnoses that they ought to receive, and therefore they ought to seek treatment for that disorder. And so this could explain why men are diagnosed at higher rates than women. Guys, do you have any thoughts on this? This has led to some really rich discussion in the other groups. Oh, it's so much harder when you're just your initials on the screen. Okay, so let me ask some questions for you then. Do you think we ought to create separate diagnostic criteria for men and for women? If it looks different, then should we create different criteria?
Are there any other mental illnesses that do have different diagnostics for men and women?
I don't know that they do, although autism we know is very, very different in men and women. So I think they do acknowledge in the DSM, in women it may manifest in X, Y, and Z, whereas in boys it might manifest as A, B, and C. Although it's not totally different, it's just, for example, boys might get very into sort of maths or trains or things like that, whereas that kind of focus in women could be obsession with a pop star. And which is kind of like more accepted for girls to be obsessed with pop stars. But actually that could be a sign of autism in girls, not boys. So we do recognize it in some disorders, but not to the extent of having separate criteria. What are your thoughts there, Ben?
If it's only like one or two mental illnesses where they do actually do it, then I don't think they should, because maybe it is just biased. Yeah, I think maybe it is just biased, and maybe, like, for example, men, they're not as insightful into themselves, like, because women have got that social network, so they can recognize it in themselves sooner than men could. And because men have negative symptoms as well, it's a removal, so it's harder to point it out than, like, for example, it's easier to, they maybe see apathy, avolition, delusions. One is going to be easier to see than another. So
yeah, absolutely. And we know men are not good at going to the doctor, and so it could be that women seek help earlier and therefore get help before a diagnosis is needed. It's more sort of interventionist practices rather than men who probably leave it until they've got full-blown psychosis. That could be perhaps a reason as well.
Like women might like the not they might become, I don't know if they become depressed earlier, because you say that's because they may become depressed earlier, and therefore the depression is treated and it won't get any worse and might not turn schizophrenia if it's like that.
Maybe, perhaps, I'm not sure about the ages for depression, but yeah, I think that's a valid possibility. Yeah. And I guess, we want to be careful here not to exaggerate the differences between men and women by creating separate disorders for both. There is still a lot of similarity between men and women with the disorder. How do we overcome this? How do we make sure that we are diagnosing women who genuinely have the disorder? Perhaps we include more women in samples when studying schizophrenics. Women are often neglected, so therefore we don't have good representation of what schizophrenia in women looks like. Hi, Lib. Hi. I've recorded from the start, and so you can go back and watch this later on. So yeah, perhaps we just need more female representation in schizophrenic samples, and so that their experiences are going to be included in the literature, and then hopefully clinicians will be able to recognize in women this might be more relevant than what we see in men. Perhaps it's nice to see. Okay, all right.
Miss, I was just going to say, a lot more of the studies done on men in schizophrenia.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Not just schizophrenia, but basically any medical disorder, women are generally excluded because women's hormones fluctuate throughout the month, whereas men's don't. And so you need that consistency in a clinical drug trial, for example, or any intervention or treatment. And so, women are often not included.
Okay, is that because the hormones will influence maybe their result?
Exactly. Yeah. It will influence how drugs work. Yeah. And with so many clinical trials, the risk of women getting pregnant is high, and you don't want to risk then any issues with a developing fetus. And so it's easier to just exclude women. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okie doke. Any other questions about gender bias before we move on to culture bias?
Miss, has there been any research on like transgender people with schizophrenia?
Oh, I don't know, Neve. I really don't know. I think we're looking at such small samples there. I'm not sure. And I think you're raising a really good point, is that we're kind of raising this false dichotomy, aren't we? Saying gender bias, men versus women. But I think there's a gender bias in that we don't really know, in other genders or how schizophrenia manifests. Oh, it's a great question, Neve. You could do some research
Miss,
into that. Hey.
But like, they're still going to have the same like structures of a man or a woman, even if they're transgender. It's not going to make any difference in that sense.
Yeah, but it'll be interesting if we look at the difference between sex and gender, how that
Yeah.
might influence how somebody experiences schizophrenia.
Hmm.
Do transgender women experience schizophrenia in the way that biological women do?
Yeah, that's true.
And is it society that's shaping the symptoms, or is it biology? That's a really interesting question. Great thinking, Neve. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to then culture bias, and I hope that this interests you. This is really fascinating, and this requires some of your input, please. Okay, so culture bias concerns a tendency to overdiagnose people of particular cultures. That schizophrenia is being diagnosed by typically middle-class white men, and so just keep that in mind. All right, so the evidence here in Britain, Afro-Caribbeans from the West Indies are 7 times more likely than white Britons to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. So, some questions for you here. Do you think there is an underlying biological reason that could be the case? Can you use your little hand thing? Whether you've got a suggestion or not as to what that biological reason could be, do you think there might be? Okay, no. Okay, perhaps not. Okay, well then, let me tell you a little bit of research. I don't expect you to write this down because it's not a reason as such, but it's just an idea. In Afro-Caribbean countries, they have much lower rates of flu than we do here. We know that maternal exposure to the flu increases somebody's risk of schizophrenia. So could it be that when Afro-Caribbeans move from the West Indies to Britain, their immunity to the flu is really low, and therefore they're more likely to be susceptible to the effects of flu, which might include schizophrenia? Question? Thoughts? Tell me you think that's rubbish.
I was going to say how like the flu like changes every year as well. So
Yep.
Even if they didn't have immunity, maybe because in the past there isn't much flu, as it changes every year, I think it will influence everyone pretty. It'd be pretty similar between every different culture.
Yeah. I think over time, though, you generally do build up immunity. I know you have to get the flu jab every year because it mutates, but we do have better immunity than Afro-Caribbeans.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's a nice, it's good thinking. Other thoughts? What do you think?
I think it's rubbish.
Good. So what do you think is the reason for Afro-Caribbeans being diagnosed more?
Well, for example, when they come over here, they usually are migrating over here and maybe leave their families behind, for example, with Windrush and stuff like that. So they're just going to be more stressed out because they are migrating from their home country to another country.
Yep.
Migration
stress could be an environmental stressor. But then why don't we see it in South Asians or Eastern Europeans?
Do we not?
It's a great idea, but we should see increased incidence in other races as well. That's the most logical reason, Ben, but that only goes maybe part of the way. So let's have a look at some of these reasons. So, okay, not only are Afro-Caribbeans 7 times more likely to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia than white Britons, but they are more likely to be confined to enclosed institutions, so like secure psychiatric hospitals. So that's happening. They are perhaps not more susceptible, ignoring that sort of flu argument for a second, which, as Ben says, is perhaps bogus. In the West Indies, in their own countries, the rates of schizophrenia are still 1%, like they are in the UK. So Afro-Caribbeans within the West Indies in their own culture are not being diagnosed at higher rates than Britons are in Britain. So Brits are in Britain. So the rates aren't actually higher. What could be explaining this? There's a few things that we need to consider. Possible explanations. Racism. We've got white psychiatrists typically diagnosed that when black people present with symptoms of schizophrenia, they're seen as perhaps more dangerous and more in need of being confined to psychiatric hospitals. Could there be this implicit racism under the surface where psychiatrists, whether knowingly or not, are thinking that the disorder is worse in black people than white people? What do you think about that?
Miss, could you say about how maybe the testing facilities are probably not as good in the West Indies compared to like the UK? So maybe less people are going to be diagnosed over there. So that might be a reason. No,
I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that's the case. They're still using the same diagnostic criteria. The doctors are still trained the exact same. Like, yeah. This is just an idea. These are just suggestions. There could be implicit racism, could be institutionalized racism happening here. As you suggested, Ben, perhaps being a first, second, third generation migrant comes with added stress of having to adapt to a new culture, perhaps learn a new language, perhaps leave your family behind, start from scratch. All of those could be environmental stresses, which we know increases the risk of schizophrenia. And that definitely is contributing to this increased rates in Afro-Caribbean. But it cannot be the whole picture because, as we said, we don't see this increased incidence in Eastern Europeans or South Asians or any other population of migrants. So that can't be the whole picture either. What is more likely is that schizophrenia looks a little bit different in different cultures. We just said, do you remember when we spoke about delusions and how I said delusions manifest differently across time? It used to be about aliens and now it's about technology. And so your delusions and your symptoms are likely to be influenced by your surrounding culture. In particular Afro-Caribbean cultures, speaking with dead ancestors is seen as a normal part of the grieving process. If that happened in the UK, what would a psychiatrist think? Speaking with something and hearing voices that aren't there could be an auditory hallucination. So for white psychiatrists who are seeing Afro-Caribbeans saying that they're hearing voices, well, that could be then enough for a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But in the West Indies, when an Afro-Caribbean presents with that as a symptom, that's not going to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia because that's a normal part of that cultural practice of grieving. Ben, you've got your mic unmuted. What do you think?
Yeah, but aren't there many people still in the UK who are religious and believe in God and do believe that God is literally speaking to them, which is the same principle of some person speaking to you in your head?
I don't know if they literally believe God's speaking to them, though.
Or maybe they believe they're getting signs from God, which many Afro-Caribbean people may feel like they're getting signs.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know about the UK. It's not that common. But I know in the US, like, you get Southern Baptists who speak in tongues and that kind of thing and believe that they're possessed by the Holy Spirit. I guess there's, that could be seen as delusional as well. But I guess that in isolation is not going to be enough. I think, I don't know. I don't really have a satisfactory answer for you, Ben, I'm afraid. I see your point that we can see this in other populations and groups as well. But anyway, so that's that second last point. Ethnic differences in symptom expression is overlooked. And so we might incorrectly diagnose somebody with a different culture as having schizophrenia and schizophrenia symptoms, even if they don't have the disorder, just because cultural practices differ. No matter the reason, whether it's racism, whether it's increased stress of being a migrant, whatever it is, there's an issue with diagnosing cross-culturally. Whenever we have psychiatrists of one culture diagnosing people of other cultures, then issues are going to arise. So we need to develop a better understanding of how schizophrenia looks in other cultures. So, guys, are there any questions about any of that? No? Okay. Last point before I'm just going to send you off to plan some essays. There's not enough here to really discuss this as an AO3 paragraph, for instance, but Just the point of that labeling. You know, schizophrenia is a really sticky label. It comes with negative connotations, with stigma, with stereotyping and discrimination. Once you get that label, it's very, very hard to shake. It makes it very, very hard to maintain relationships, to get a job, to live a normal life. We need to make sure that when we're diagnosing schizophrenia, we're getting it right. Because if we're not, and if we're diagnosing people with schizophrenia who don't have it, it's going to lead to labeling. And in some cases, it could destroy lives. So we need to just be very, very careful and make sure that we take the diagnosis and classification very, very seriously. I wanted to show you, and you can go away in a minute and watch this if you want, the Rosanen Staying Sane in Insane Places experiment. Basically, him and a handful of his friends got themselves admitted to a psychiatric hospital, saying that they heard voices, saying things like thud. And once they were inside, they were given a diagnosis of schizophrenia or psychosis, and then they acted completely normally. And some of them didn't get out for like 2 months. Some of them were stuck inside these psychiatric hospitals, even though they were totally healthy. And everything they did while inside was seen through this lens of insanity. Like, they were taking notes about how the nurses were treating them, and they were saying in their case notes by the psychiatrists, so-and-so is delusional and thinks that they are a psychologist. And everything was just deemed to be crazy. And so that can be a real problem. Once you've got that label, it's very, very hard to shake. In the latter part of the experiment, Rosanen then, after all the people were released from hospital, he then sent the hospitals a letter saying, over the next 6 months, we're going to send some participants, some pseudo patients like we did last time. And then 3 months later, wrote them again and said, tell us who and how many people you thought were pseudo patients that we sent. And every single hospital wrote back and said, yeah, we thought, there were 5. We thought there were 10 patients that were pseudo patients. And they didn't send any. And yet all the hospitals admitted that there were patients in there that they believed shouldn't and weren't crazy and shouldn't have been confined. So it just goes to show how bad we are at diagnosing mental illness, and that once you do get a diagnosis, it sticks. So something to be really mindful of, and this is why getting the diagnosis right is crucial. So gonna leave it there, actually. So your tasks now, you've got, there's 2 possible essays that you could get with the topic we've just covered. You could get the one on the left, discuss the diagnosis and classification of schizophrenia, or you could get the one on the right, discuss issues with the diagnosis and classification of schizophrenia. So they look very, very different. Does anyone want to have a go at suggesting what the AO1 and AO3 might look like for the one on the left, discuss the diagnosis and classification of schizophrenia?
Miss, wouldn't you say what what schizophrenia is, and then talk about positive, negative symptoms, and talk about how they diagnose schizophrenia? I'm not for your AO3. I'm not so sure.
Anyone want to have a go at
that'd be
AO3?
the AO1.
That's the AO1. Perfect. Yep. AO3, guys. You basically just pick 3 of these to discuss. One issue with the diagnosis and classification of schizophrenia is symptom overlap. Define what symptom overlap is, display the evidence for symptom overlap, and then discuss the issues with that. And then do that for 2 more of the issues. Pick the 3 that you can discuss most successfully. That's the easy essay, I think. Does that make sense, Ben? Can you see how that is no different to normal?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
The one on the right-hand side is a little bit trickier. Discuss issues with the diagnosis and classification of schizophrenia. What's AO1? What's AO3?
Is it asking to be written in the gender bias essay format or the cultural bias essay format with issues and debates like P and C, or is it asking actually AO1, AO3, AO3?
No, there's not so much of a divide of AO1 and AO3. In fact, every paragraph is going to contain some AO1 and then AO3. And so it's going to be far more integrated. I've actually got a model essay for this that I've either distributed or will distribute in just a second to your OneNotes. Can someone just check in your classwork section whether you've got the model essay for this in there? And just let me know. And I'll jump on the computer and just check. So what I would like you to do...
I think we have it.
You've got it. Fantastic. And
I think we do, yeah.
Fabulous, thank you. And so I've also distributed a page then that's got 2 essay plans for these 2 different essays. One for the diagnosis, is to discuss the diagnosis, and one for discuss the issues with diagnosis. And so you can plan the diagnosis one on the left easily. You can go off and do that now. For the one on the right, you can use my model essay to work backwards and write a plan. Or if you don't like the paragraphs that I've written, if you want to choose different points to discuss, different issues, then you can have a go at planning your own. And that's what we've got for the rest of the lesson. So I'm just going to go and check what's distributed to your OneNotes now. Sorry, I didn't have enough time. You can imagine this morning was a bit manic, a bit chaotic, but I'm glad to see that we've got 9 of you here. That's fab. Okay, so I'm going to stay here. If you guys have whatever you need, you don't need to hang about. You can just have a go at planning those essays and I'll check them. And then, yeah, if you've got questions, you can just jump back on and ask me. Does that all sound all okay?
Miss,
Lip.
how do we watch the video that you've been recording?
Okay, so as soon as I press end, it will be available on the channel. So if you go on to 7sci3, it should appear there as a video.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, good question. I'll release a task on Firefly to the others that aren't here, and I'll put the instructions for the essay planning and for where to find the video on there. So if you're not sure, you can just look at that. Does that sound okay?
Yep, sounds good.
Fab. Thanks. Thank you for joining, guys. I know that it was probably a big rush for you as well this morning. So I'm going to stop recording now and then hang about if you've got questions.